Foundations of Western Political Thought. Module 14, Design and Emergence, Rawls, Hayek, and Sowell. The 20th century conducted experiments in political philosophy that no ethics committee would have approved. Tens of millions died in the attempt to build socialism. Tens of millions more died resisting it or fleeing it or caught in wars it helped to cause. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cambodia, North Korea, Cuba, each claimed to be building a just society according to rational principles. Each produced tyranny, poverty, and mass graves. By mid-century, the question was urgent. What kind of society should we build? Or should we be building at all? Perhaps the very attempt to design society according to a rational plan was the problem. Perhaps justice was not something to be constructed, but something to emerge from rules and institutions we did not fully understand. Two thinkers came to define this argument. John Rawls, an American philosopher, offered the most sophisticated defense of designed justice the century produced. Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian economist, offered the most devastating critique of the designing mind. Between them, they mapped the terrain on which we still argue today. The path divides. First Rawls, the original position, the veil of ignorance, the difference principle, the most sophisticated attempt to design justice the 20th century produced. We examine what made it so influential and why critics from left and right found it wanting. Then Hayek, the knowledge problem that no planner can solve, spontaneous order that no designer can match, the road to serfdom that good intentions pave. Then Sowell, who made the argument empirical, who asked not what theory predicts, but what actually happened when progressive policies met reality. By the end you will understand why intelligent people still disagree about whether justice is something we design or something we discover, and why the evidence has not settled the question. John Rawls, The Architecture of Fairness. John Rawls was born in Baltimore in 1921, the second of 5 sons in a prominent family. His father was a successful lawyer, his mother an activist for women's suffrage. 2 tragedies marked his childhood. 2 younger brothers died from illnesses they contracted from him, diphtheria and pneumonia. Some biographers see in this early, irrational guilt the seeds of his later preoccupation with undeserved fortune and misfortune. He studied at Princeton, where he wrote a senior thesis on the meaning of sin and faith. He considered entering the Episcopal priesthood. Then came the war. Rawls served in the Pacific as an infantryman. He was in New Guinea, the Philippines, Japan. He saw combat. After the Japanese surrender, he was among the American soldiers who witnessed the aftermath of Hiroshima. The experience shattered what remained of his religious faith. How could a just God permit such things? He turned from theology to philosophy, but the questions about justice remain. After the war, Princeton for his doctorate, then teaching positions at Cornell and MIT before settling at Harvard in 1962. He spent the next decade working on his masterpiece. A Theory of Justice appeared in 1971. It is not light reading, over 500 pages of careful, systematic argument, but its influence was immediate and immense. It became the most discussed work of political philosophy in the English-speaking world, the book against which all subsequent work had to position itself. The original position. Rawls's central device is the original position, a thought experiment designed to determine what principles of justice rational people would choose. Imagine you are designing the basic structure of society, its constitution, its economic system, its major institutions, that you do not know what position you will occupy in that society. You do not know whether you will be rich or poor, talented or ordinary, healthy or sick, male or female, member of the majority or a minority. This is the veil of ignorance. Behind the veil, Rawls argues, you would not choose a society that favors any particular group because you might turn out to be in a disfavored group. You would not choose a caste system because you might be born into the lowest caste. You would not choose a society that rewards only certain talents because you might lack those talents. What would you choose? Rawls argues you would choose two principles in order of priority. First, the liberty principle. Each person should have the most extensive basic liberties compatible with similar liberties for all. These include political liberty, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience, freedom from arbitrary arrest, the right to hold personal property. Second, the difference principle. Social and economic inequalities should be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Inequalities are permitted only if they make the worst off better than they would be under equality. The second principle is the controversial one. It does not require equality of outcome. It permits inequalities, even substantial ones, but only if those inequalities work to improve the position of those at the bottom. A surgeon may earn more than a cleaner, but only if the system that produces this inequality also produces better outcomes for cleaners than a system of strict equality would. The appeal of Rawls. Why did this argument prove so influential? Rawls offered a systematic justification for the welfare state and redistributive taxation that did not depend on utility calculations or contested claims about what makes people happy. It depended instead on a procedure, what would rational people choose, that seemed neutral between different conceptions of the good life. He also took seriously an intuition many people share, that the circumstances of our birth are arbitrary from a moral point of view. You did not earn your native talents. You did not choose your parents, your country, your historical moment. If you are intelligent, healthy, and born into a stable family in a wealthy nation, that is luck, not merit. For those who share this intuition, Rawls provides a rigorous framework. Society should be arranged so that arbitrary advantages do not translate automatically into better life outcomes. The talented may benefit from their talents, but only in ways that also lift up those who were less fortunate in the natural lottery. Rawls called this justice as fairness. The basic structure of society should be fair, should not arbitrarily favor some over others, and the original position is the device for determining what fairness requires. The debt to Kant is obvious. Rawls was trying to do for political philosophy what Kant had done for ethics, ground it in pure reason, in principles that any rational person must accept. The original position is a political version of the categorical imperative, a procedure for testing whether principles could be willed universally, stripped of the biases that particular circumstances create. Objections from the left. Not everyone found Rawls's conclusion sufficiently radical. Marxists objected that Rawls took the basic structure of liberal capitalism for granted. He wanted to redistribute within the system, not to transform the system itself. The difference principle might improve the lot of the worst off, but it still accepted a society based on private property, wage labor, and market exchange. It was amelioration, not liberation. Others on the left noted that Rawls focused on distribution of goods, income, wealth, opportunities, rather than on relations of power. You can redistribute income while leaving structures of domination intact. A society might satisfy the difference principle while workers remain subordinate to employers, women to men, racial minorities to majorities. Justice requires more than fair distribution. It requires dismantling hierarchy. Some argue that the veil of ignorance, by stripping away all particular identities, erased the very differences of race, gender, culture, history that generate injustice in the real world. A procedure that ignores who you are cannot address wrongs done to you because of who you are. Objections from the right. The objections from the other direction were more fundamental. Robert Nozick, Rawls' colleague at Harvard, published Anarchy, State and Utopia in 1974, in part as a direct response to a theory of justice. Nozick argued that justice was not about patterns of distribution at all. It was about how holdings were acquired and transferred. If you acquired something justly through your own labor, through voluntary exchange, through gift, it is yours. No one, including the state, has the right to take it from you and give it to someone else, regardless of how the resulting distribution looks. Taxation for redistribution, in Nozick's phrase, is on a par with forced labor. Nozick offered what he called an entitlement theory of justice. A distribution is just if it arose from a prior just distribution by just steps. The question is not whether the pattern looks fair, but whether each transaction was voluntary. If I trade my labor for wages and spend my wages on goods and give some of my goods to charity, each step is just, and the resulting distribution is just, even if it looks very unequal. To illustrate, Nozick imagined a society that began with whatever distribution Rawls would consider just. Now, suppose 1 million people each pay 25 cents to watch a famous basketball player. Nozick used Wilt Chamberlain as his example. The basketball player now has $250,000 more than before. Is this unjust? Each transaction was voluntary. No one was forced to pay. Each person who paid presumably valued seeing the player more than keeping their quarter. Yet the resulting distribution is unequal. To maintain the original pattern, the state would have to continuously interfere with voluntary transactions, forbidding people from paying to watch basketball or confiscating the player's earnings. Pattern principles of justice, Nozick argued, require continuous interference with liberty. Only a historical entitlement theory, which asks how holdings were acquired, not what pattern they form, respects individual freedom. The veil of ignorance, Nozick argued, was rigged. It assumed that the talents and abilities you possess are not really yours, that they are a common asset to be deployed for collective benefit, but this denies self-ownership. My talents are mine, not society's. I may choose to use them for others' benefit, but that is charity, not justice. Other conservatives objected that Rawls's procedure was too abstract, too disconnected from actual human communities. The original position strips away everything that makes you who you are: your family, your traditions, your loyalties, your history. What remains is not a person, but a calculating abstraction. Real justice, these critics argued, is not designed from behind a veil. It emerges from the practices and traditions of actual communities. It is embedded in relationships, parent and child, neighbor and neighbor, citizen and nation, that the original position ignores. Rawls offered a blueprint for nowhere, a constitution for people who do not exist. Libertarians made a sharper objection still. Why assume that the contractors behind the veil would be risk-averse, choosing to maximize the minimum position? A rational gambler might prefer a society with higher variance, more inequality, but greater potential for extraordinary success. Rawls assumed his contractors would play it safe, but that is a psychological assumption, not a logical necessity. And anarcho-capitalists rejected the entire frame. The original position assumes there will be a state with coercive power to enforce whatever principles are chosen. But the state itself is the problem, an institution that claims a monopoly on legitimate violence and uses it to expropriate and control. You cannot design a just coercive institution because coercion is inherently unjust. Only voluntary association is legitimate. Rawls's retreat. Rawls himself came to acknowledge difficulties with his original project. A theory of justice had presented justice as fairness, as the correct moral theory, true for all rational beings, derivable from the nature of practical reason itself. But this comprehensive claim proved hard to sustain. Why should a devout Catholic, a traditional Muslim, a Burkean conservative, or a Nietzschean individualist accept Rawls' premises? Each had their own account of human nature, the good life, and the purpose of society. In Political Liberalism, published in 1993, Rawls retreated. He now presented justice as fairness as a political conception, not a comprehensive moral doctrine. It was designed for the limited purpose of governing the basic structure of a pluralistic society in which people disagreed about fundamental values. The problem Rawls now addressed was what he called the fact of reasonable pluralism. In modern democratic societies, people hold different and incompatible comprehensive doctrines, religious, philosophical, moral worldviews that shape their entire lives. Catholics and atheists, Kantians and utilitarians, traditionalists and progressives all share the same political space. A theory of justice had seemed to offer one more comprehensive doctrine, competing with the others. But how could a liberal society impose one comprehensive view on citizens who reasonably held different views? This would contradict liberalism's own commitment to respecting persons as free and equal. The solution was to make justice as fairness freestanding, not derived from any particular comprehensive doctrine, but capable of being endorsed by many different doctrines from their own perspectives. A Catholic might endorse it because it respects human dignity. A Kantian might endorse it because it treats persons as ends, not means. A utilitarian might endorse it because fair institutions tend to maximize welfare over time. This overlapping consensus would provide stability for the right reasons, not because people were coerced or manipulated, but because they genuinely endorsed the political principles from within their own worldviews. Rawls also introduced the idea of public reason. When citizens deliberate about fundamental political questions, constitutional essentials, and matters of basic justice, they should appeal only to reasons that all reasonable citizens could accept. They should not appeal to the particular doctrines of their faith or philosophy, since fellow citizens who do not share those doctrines could not be expected to find such appeals persuasive. Public reason was controversial. It seemed to exclude religious arguments from political debate, which many religious citizens found objectionable. Why should they bracket their deepest convictions when deliberating about justice? Rawls later softened this requirement, allowing comprehensive doctrines to be invoked, provided they were supplemented by public reasons in due course. Critics saw this as an admission of defeat. The original project had been to ground justice in reason itself, to find principles that any rational person must accept. Now Rawls was saying merely that justice as fairness was a workable compromise for societies that happened to be pluralistic. It was no longer a philosophical truth, but a political accommodation. The veil of ignorance, which had seemed to reveal what justice truly required, now revealed only what certain kinds of societies might agree upon. The Kantian ambition had been quietly abandoned. Friedrich Hayek, The Limits of Reason. Friedrich August von Hayek was born in Vienna in 1899 into the intellectual ferment of the dying Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family was academic. His father, a doctor, with botanical interests. His grandfathers, both scholars. The young Hayek was interested in everything: psychology, economics, philosophy, law. He came of age amid catastrophe. The First World War destroyed the Habsburg Empire. The peace brought hyperinflation that wiped out his family's savings. He watched a sophisticated, cultured society tear itself apart. The experience immunized him against utopian promises. He studied law and political science at the University of Vienna, where he encountered the Austrian school of economics, the tradition of Karl Menger and Ludwig von Mises. Mises was then engaged in a debate that would prove prophetic. Could a socialist economy function without markets? The socialists said yes. A central planning board could gather information about resources, preferences, and production possibilities and allocate accordingly. There was nothing markets did that rational planning could not do better without the waste and injustice of capitalism. Mises said no. Without market prices, there was no way to calculate costs and benefits. How should a planning board decide whether to build a bridge from steel or from concrete? The answer depends on the relative scarcity of steel and concrete, which depends on the thousands of alternative uses for each material, which depends on the preferences and knowledge of millions of people. Market prices encode all this information. Without them, economic calculation is impossible. The planner is blind. The socialist economists responded. Oscar Lange and others developed models of market socialism in which planners would simulate market outcomes, adjusting prices by trial and error until supply and demand balanced. This seemed, to many observers, to answer Mises' challenge. Hayek showed why it did not. The problem was not merely computational, not just that the calculations were complex. The problem was epistemological. The knowledge required for economic coordination was dispersed across millions of minds embedded in local circumstances, often tacit and unarticulated. It was not the kind of knowledge that could be gathered at a center and processed, no matter how powerful the computers. This insight, the knowledge problem, became the cornerstone of Hayek's thought and his most enduring contribution. The knowledge problem. Hayek's central contribution is the knowledge problem. It is in its way as important to political philosophy as the veil of ignorance, and it leads in precisely the opposite direction. The argument is simple but devastating. Economic life requires coordination. Millions of people must make billions of decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom. These decisions are interdependent. What I should produce depends on what you want to consume, which depends on what you produce, which depends on what others want, and so on, in endless complexity. How is this coordination achieved? In a market economy, it is achieved through prices. Prices are signals that convey information. When the price of oil rises, it tells producers to find more oil and consumers to use less, without anyone needing to know why the price rose. Maybe there was a war in the Middle East, maybe a new technology increased demand, maybe a pipeline broke. The reasons do not matter. The price conveys everything the decision-maker needs to know. This is remarkable because the knowledge required for economic coordination is not concentrated anywhere. It is dispersed across millions of minds. The farmer knows his soil and weather. The engineer knows her machines. The consumer knows his preferences. No one knows everything. Everyone knows something. A central planning board faces an impossible task, gathering all this dispersed knowledge, much of which is tacit, known, but not articulable, and using it to make millions of interdependent decisions. The knowledge problem is not merely that the planners lack information. It is that the relevant information does not exist in a form that could be transmitted to them. It is embedded in skills, habits, local knowledge, and practical judgment that cannot be reduced to statistics. The curious task of economics, Hayek wrote in The Fatal Conceit, is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. This is Burke translated into economics. Burke had argued that tradition embodied wisdom that no individual could fully articulate, the accumulated experience of generations tested by time. Hayek gave this argument a new foundation. It was not merely that tradition was wise, it was that the knowledge required for social coordination was dispersed across millions of minds and could not be centralized. The case against rationalist planning was not sentimental attachment to the past, but epistemological humility about the limits of reason. Spontaneous order. Markets are an example of what Hayek called spontaneous order, complex functional arrangements that emerge from human action but not from human design. Language is another example. No one designed English. No committee sat down and decided that dog should mean dog. The language evolved over centuries, shaped by millions of speakers, adapting to needs no one foresaw. Yet it works, it conveys meaning, it has grammar and syntax, it supports poetry and science and law. The common law is another. English law was not designed by a legislator, but emerged from centuries of judicial decisions, each responding to particular circumstances, gradually building up a body of precedent. No one planned it, yet it proved more adaptable and more protective of liberty than rationalist legal codes designed from first principles. Hayek distinguished between two kinds of order. Axis is made order, an organization designed for a purpose, like an army or a corporation. Cosmos is grown order, a spontaneous arrangement that emerges from individuals following rules like a market or a language. The socialist planner treats society as taxis, an organization to be designed and directed toward chosen ends. But society is cosmos, a spontaneous order too complex to be designed, embodying more knowledge than any designer could possess. The attempt to treat cosmos as taxis, to rationally design what can only evolve, is what Hayek called the fatal conceit. It is not merely inefficient, it is destructive. It destroys the information embedded in prices. It destroys the incentives that coordinate individual plans. It destroys the freedom that allows individuals to use their own knowledge for their own purposes. The road to serfdom. In 1944, as the war against fascism was being won, Hayek published a warning about a different danger. The road to serfdom argued that central economic planning, however well-intentioned, led inevitably toward totalitarianism. The argument was not that socialists were secret tyrants. It was that the logic of planning required ever-expanding control. A planning board must decide what to produce, but production involves trade-offs. More guns means less butter. To make these decisions, the planners must have a scale of values, a ranking of priorities. Whose values? In a diverse society, people disagree about what matters. The planners must impose one set of values on everyone. And to make the plan work, the planners must control not just production, but labor. Workers must go where the plan requires. If the plan needs more miners and fewer musicians, people must be directed accordingly. Freedom of occupation disappears. Control expands further. If people can spend their income freely, they might make choices that disrupt the plan. Controls on consumption follow. If people can speak freely, they might criticize the plan. Controls on expression follow. If people can organize freely, they might resist. Controls on association follow. The road to serfdom is not paved by villains but by idealists who discover that each intervention requires another to make it work until freedom has been consumed entirely. Hayek was not arguing that Sweden was about to become the Soviet Union. He was arguing that the logic of comprehensive planning points in one direction, and that society should understand where that logic leads before they start down the road. The Constitution of Liberty. The road to serfdom was a warning, primarily negative, explaining what to avoid. In the Constitution of Liberty, published in 1960, Hayek offered a more positive via what institutions actually support freedom. His answer centered on the rule of law, but rule of law in a specific sense. Not merely that government acts through law, but that law has certain characteristics. It must be general, applying to all equally. It must be abstract, not targeting particular individuals or groups. It must be prospective, not retrospective, and it must be stable, not changing at the whim of rulers. These characteristics matter because they make law predictable. When you know the rules in advance, you can plan your life. You can take risks, make investments, enter contracts, knowing what the legal consequences will be. The rule of law enables what Hayek called the extended order cooperation among strangers who need not know or trust each other personally. Arbitrary power is the enemy of this order. When rulers can change the rules at will, when law targets particular people, when the consequences of action are unpredictable, planning becomes impossible. People retreat into small circles of personal trust. The extended order of civilization contracts into clans, mafias, and patronage networks. Hayek distinguished between law and legislation. Law, properly understood, is discovered. It emerges from custom, from judicial decisions, from the practical resolution of disputes. Legislation is made. It is the command of a sovereign, an act of will. The common law is law in the proper sense. Much modern statute is merely legislation dressed in legal form. This distinction matters because discovered law tends to have the characteristics of true law: generality, abstraction, stability. It evolves to serve the needs of those who live under it. Made law tends toward particularity, serving the purposes of those who make it. It is a tool of power, not a framework for freedom. Law, Legislation and Liberty. In his late trilogy, Law, Legislation and Liberty, published between 1973 and 1979, Hayek developed these themes further. He argued that modern democracies had confused two different tasks: the task of articulating general rules of just conduct and the task of directing government action. True law, the rules of just conduct, should be abstract and general. It tells people what they may not do to each other. Do not steal, do not defraud, do not break contracts. It does not tell them what goals to pursue or how to live. It creates a framework within which individuals pursue their own purposes. Government direction is different. It concerns the organization of public services, the allocation of public resources, the management of public affairs. Here, specificity is appropriate. The government must decide to build this road, fund this hospital, deploy this army. The confusion of these tasks, Hayek argued, was the source of much political dysfunction. When legislatures make both general law and specific policy, they are tempted to make law serve policy, to pass legislation that looks like law but is really a tool for achieving particular outcomes. The result is the corruption of law itself. Hayek proposed constitutional reforms to separate these functions. One assembly for general legislation, another for government direction. Whether these proposals were practicable is doubtful. But the diagnosis that modern democracy tends to corrupt law into an instrument of particular interests resonated with critics across the political spectrum. Objections to Hayek. Hayek's critics responded from several directions. From the left, the objection was that Hayek ignored power. Markets are not neutral arenas where free individuals exchange. They are shaped by existing distributions of wealth and power. Those who start with more end up with more. Those who start with nothing have nothing to exchange. Market outcomes reflect market inputs, and the inputs are unjust. The knowledge problem, critics argued, cuts both ways. If central planners cannot gather enough information to plan efficiently, neither can markets guarantee just outcomes. Markets process information about preferences backed by purchasing power, not about needs, not about merit, not about justice. A market will provide luxury goods for the rich before necessities for the poor, because the rich can pay more. Some noted that Hayek's own framework depended on institutions that did not emerge spontaneously. Markets require property rights, contract enforcement, courts, police, the apparatus of the state. The line between cosmos and taxis is blurry. Every actually existing market is embedded in a framework of designed rules. Others pointed out that spontaneous orders can be spontaneously unjust. Racial discrimination emerged spontaneously in many societies. Cartels emerge spontaneously when competitors find it profitable to collude. The fact that an order is undesigned does not make it good. And even some sympathetic to Hayek's economics questioned his political conclusions. The road to serfdom seemed not to have been taken by Scandinavian social democracies, which combined extensive welfare states with robust democratic freedoms. Perhaps the logic of planning was not as inexorable as Hayek suggested. Yet when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many saw vindication of Hayek's core claims. The socialist calculation debate had been settled, not by argument but by history. Central planning could not match market coordination. The attempt to do so had produced chronic shortages, misallocation, corruption, and eventual collapse. The former socialist countries rushed to establish market economies. Hayek, who had been dismissed as an extremist in the decades when Keynesianism and social democracy were ascendant, received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974 and lived to see his ideas return to influence. He died in 1992, having witnessed the failure of the system he had spent his life opposing. Whether this vindicated his broader political philosophy, his warnings about the welfare state, his opposition to progressive taxation, his skepticism of democracy, is more contested. The Soviet collapse proved that comprehensive central planning failed. It did not prove that all government intervention leads to serfdom. Objections from deeper right. From a different angle, some conservatives found Hayek too liberal, too focused on markets and individual freedom, too dismissive of tradition, community, and the non-economic dimensions of social life. Hayek famously wrote an essay titled, "Why I Am Not a Conservative." He saw himself as a classical liberal, committed to individual liberty and spontaneous order. Conservatives, he thought, were too willing to use state power to enforce traditional values, too hostile to change, too comfortable with hierarchy. But traditional conservatives might reply that Hayek's spontaneous order is corrosive of the very traditions he claims to respect. Markets disrupt communities. They value everything by price and nothing by meaning. They uproot people, dissolve loyalties, replace the thick ties of family and place with the thin ties of contract and exchange. A Birkin might add that evolved institutions deserve respect precisely because they embody accumulated wisdom. But markets destroy evolved institutions as readily as they destroy inefficient ones. The market does not distinguish between a profitable innovation and a profitable destruction. Thomas Sowell, The Empirical Challenge. The argument between Rawls and Hayek is largely theoretical. Thomas Sowell made it empirical. Sowell was born in 1930 in North Carolina, into poverty. His father died before he was born. His mother died soon after. He was raised by a great-aunt in Harlem, left home at 17, worked odd jobs, was drafted into the Marines, and eventually made his way through Harvard, Columbia, and the University of Chicago, where he studied under Milton Friedman. He began his career as a Marxist. By his own account, what changed his mind was working for the federal government. He saw how bureaucracies actually functioned, the incentives, the information problems, the gap between intention and result. He emerged a free market economist and spent the next 50 years applying economic reasoning to questions of race, culture, and social policy. His 1980 book Knowledge and Decisions extended Hayek's knowledge problem to social policy. The question was not merely whether planners could coordinate economic production, Hayek had settled that, but whether they could solve social problems. Sowell's answer was no, for the same reasons. The knowledge required to design effective interventions is dispersed, local and tacit. Planners at the center cannot know what they need to know. Their interventions, however well-intentioned, generate unintended consequences that often make things worse. A conflict of visions. In 1987, Sowell published A Conflict of Visions, which offered a framework for understanding why intelligent people persistently disagree about politics. He identified two basic visions of human nature and social possibility. The constrained vision sees human nature as fixed and flawed. People are self-interested, short-sighted, prone to error. Wisdom is scarce, knowledge is dispersed. Unintended consequences are pervasive. Social improvement comes not from redesigning institutions according to rational plans, but from channeling flawed human nature through evolved constraints, markets, traditions, laws, customs that no one fully understands, but that have been tested by time. The unconstrained vision sees human nature as malleable, even perfectible. Human beings are capable of reason, altruism, and moral progress. Social problems result from bad institutions, ignorance, or oppression, not from inherent human limitations. With the right knowledge, the right leaders, the right policies, society can be transformed. Progress is not just possible, but expected. This maps closely onto the debate between Hayek and Rawls. Hayek's spontaneous order, his skepticism about planning, his respect for tradition, these flow from the constrained vision. Rawls's original position, his confidence that reason can design just institutions, his belief that society can be arranged to benefit the least advantaged, these flow from the unconstrained vision. Sowell was not arguing that one vision was true and the other false. He was explaining why the argument between them never ends. People with different visions interpret the same evidence differently. They ask different questions, invoke different standards, and talk past each other because their fundamental assumptions about human nature and social possibility diverge. The evidence on race and policy. Sowell's most controversial work applies this framework to race. The progressive narrative holds that racial disparities in income, education, and other outcomes result from discrimination, either historical or ongoing. The solution is compensatory policy, affirmative action, targeted spending, redistribution to disadvantaged groups. This is Rawlsian logic applied to race. Sowell challenged every link in this chain. First, he showed that disparities between groups are universal and do not require discrimination to explain. Different ethnic groups have different outcomes everywhere, in every society, throughout history. Germans outperformed other European groups in multiple countries. Chinese outperformed Malays in Malaysia and Indonesians in Indonesia. Jews outperformed their neighbors across centuries and continents. Lebanese outperformed native populations in West Africa and South America. These disparities reflect differences in culture, geography, demography, and historical circumstance, not necessarily discrimination. Second, he examined the specific case of black Americans. In Ethnic America and subsequent works, he showed that black West Indian immigrants to the United States consistently outperformed native-born black Americans. Same race, same discrimination, different outcomes. Second-generation West Indians outperformed the first generation, and their children outperformed them. This pattern was difficult to explain by discrimination alone. Third, he looked at trends over time. The black middle class was growing rapidly in the decades before the Civil Rights Act and the Great Society programs. Black poverty was declining. Black labor force participation was high. Black families were largely intact. In 1960, roughly 3/4 of black children were born to married parents. After the Great Society, these trends reversed or stalled. Welfare programs created incentives that discouraged marriage and work. Minimum wage laws priced low-skilled workers, disproportionately young black men, out of the labor market. Public housing concentrated poverty. Affirmative action created stigma and mismatch. By the 2000s, more than 70% of black children were born to unmarried mothers. Sowell's argument was not that racism did not exist or did not matter. It was that well-intentioned policies often made things worse, and that the constrained vision, skeptical of planning, attentive to incentives, respectful of unintended consequences, better predicted outcomes than the unconstrained vision of rational reform. The uncomfortable implications. Sowell's work is uncomfortable because it challenges the moral self-image of progressive policy. If he is right, then the people who designed the Great Society programs, who genuinely wanted to help the poor and reduce racial inequality, actually harmed the people they intended to help. Good intentions are not enough. Knowledge of consequences matters, and the consequences of progressive social policy have often been catastrophic for the supposed beneficiaries. This does not prove that all redistribution is bad, or that government should do nothing. Sowell himself has never claimed this. It does suggest that the Rawlsian framework, design institutions to benefit the least advantaged, is not self-executing. You can design policies that you believe will benefit the least advantaged, implement them with full conviction, and watch them make things worse. The road to the underclass is paved with good intentions. Those who find Sowell's analysis persuasive see progressive racial policy as an ongoing disaster, a system that traps people in dependency, destroys families, cripples initiative, and then blames the resulting dysfunction on racism, demanding more of the same failed remedies. Those who reject his analysis argue that he ignores structural factors, that his comparisons are flawed, that the problems would be worse without intervention, and that his conclusions conveniently serve those who wish to do nothing about racial inequality. The argument continues. But anyone who wants to understand why intelligent people disagree about race and policy in America must grapple with Sowell's work. He cannot be dismissed as a crank or an ideologue. He is a serious scholar making serious arguments, and those arguments have shaped how millions of people think about these questions. The argument between them. Rawls and Hayek represent two fundamentally different approaches to political thought. Rawls asks, what principles would rational people choose for a just society? The answer is to be derived from reason, from a procedure that filters out arbitrary advantages and disadvantages. Justice is something we design. Hayek asks, what institutions allow people to coordinate their plans and use their knowledge effectively? The answer emerges from evolution, from trial and error over generations, from rules that no one designed. Justice is something we discover, embedded in practices we did not create. For Rawls, inequality is a problem requiring justification. No one deserves their natural talents or their social starting point. Society must be arranged so that arbitrary advantages benefit everyone. For Hayek, the attempt to arrange society toward any pattern of outcomes is the problem. Justice concerns rules, not results. A society of just rules may produce unequal outcomes, but this is not unjust. Attempts to correct outcomes destroy the information and incentives that make prosperity possible. For Rawls, reason can design the basic structure of a just society. The original position is a device for determining what that structure should be. For Hayek, reason is limited. No mind can grasp the complexity of social order. The attempt to redesign society according to rational principles destroys more than it creates. These are not merely different policy preferences. They are different visions of what politics is for, what reason can achieve, and what justice means. How? To recognize them today. When someone argues that inequalities are unjust unless they benefit the worst off, that the talented should be permitted to profit from their talents only if this raises the floor for everyone, they are thinking in Rawlsian terms. When someone argues that outcomes are not the business of justice, that what matters is whether the rules are fair and exchanges voluntary, they are thinking in Hayekian terms. When someone says that the circumstances of birth are morally arbitrary and should not determine life chances, Rawls. When someone says that the attempt to equalize life chances requires a level of state control incompatible with freedom, Hayek. When someone proposes that policy be designed according to what rational people would choose behind a veil of ignorance, Rawls. When someone warns that design policies have unintended consequences because planners cannot know what they need to know, Hayek and Sowell. When someone argues that disparities between groups prove discrimination and require corrective policy, they are drawing on assumptions Sowell challenges. When someone argues that well-intentioned social programs often harm their intended beneficiaries, that incentives matter more than intentions, they are applying Sowell's analysis. The welfare state, progressive taxation, redistribution to the least advantaged, affirmative action, equity programs, these are Rawlsian ideas, whatever their proponents call them. Deregulation, skepticism of government intervention, trust in market outcomes, attention to incentives and unintended consequences, these are Hayekian and Sowellian ideas, whatever their proponents call them. The argument between them is replayed in every budget debate, every dispute about taxation, every controversy about welfare, healthcare, education, race, and the proper scope of government. Neither has won, neither has lost. The argument continues. Pause and consider. Both Rawls and Hayek wrote in the shadow of totalitarianism. Both wanted to prevent its recurrence. They disagreed about what had caused it and what would prevent it. For Hayek, the danger was rationalist overreach, the belief that society could be designed according to a plan. This belief led to central planning. Central planning led to the destruction of freedom. The answer was to limit the state, respect spontaneous order, and abandon the ambition to design social outcomes. For Rawls, the danger was arbitrary power, institutions that favored some over others without justification. The answer was to design institutions according to principles that no one could reasonably reject, ensuring that the basic structure of society was fair. One saw the designing mind as the problem, the other saw the designing mind as the solution. Perhaps both were right about the dangers they identified. Rationalist overreach really did produce totalitarian nightmares. Arbitrary power really does corrupt institutions and corrode legitimacy. The question is, which danger is greater in any particular time and place? And that is a question of judgment, not of philosophy. What neither could provide is a final answer, a formula that settles the question once and for all. The 20th century's great argument remains, the 21st century's inheritance. We are still deciding how much we can design, how much we must leave to emerge, and how to tell the difference. Next we turn to thinkers who stepped back from this argument, who asked not how to design justice, but how to preserve what is worth keeping. The conservative inheritors, who found both Rawls and Hayek too rationalist, too systematic, too confident in their answers. End of Module 14.